So at the moment, we are in the middle of Disability History Month. We've got International Day of Disabled Persons coming up on the 3rd of December. And this year marks the 10-year anniversary of the introduction of the Equality Act as well. And so there's much to reflect on kind of in terms of the landscape for disabled people and communities as well. As leading change makers in disability rights and diversity and inclusion, it's wonderful to bring together Jane Hatton, CEO and founder of Evenbreak, and Adam Hyland, Director of Accessibility and Inclusion and co-founder of Diversity and Ability, to reflect on how far we've come and also, really importantly, how far is still left to go. So first, I thought it would be really useful to think back to 2010 when the Equality Act was introduced. And if you can remember your kind of thoughts at the time, if there were any hopes or aspirations for the change that the introduction of the Act would bring.
I think I was, the DDA in 1995 was a massive change, I think, for disabled people, but in some ways a bit of a disappointment as well. And I think I hoped when the new Act came in that would strengthen what was already under the DDA, and it might become more inclusive, strengthen it generally. My concern was, and I think to some extent it's been borne out, that by bringing all of the single discrimination acts together under one act, it would dilute the different things that different characteristics, might need. In one sense, that was great because it meant we were looking at intersectionality, and it was about people rather than about, what makes us different. And lots of us sit in, a number of different protected characteristics. But there was a danger that it would become, I don't know if we were sophisticated enough then to not lose the important bits from each of those separate acts, and particularly in terms of disability, the one thing that makes us different from the other protected characteristics is the structural barriers that we face, not just the, perceptual barriers. And I was a bit worried that might be a bit diluted. But I think I hoped that it would launch, the conversation again, that we'd be talking about inclusion and accessibility, and that it would give us a kind of catalyst for employers, and society generally to think more about inclusion of everybody, but obviously including disabled people. Those were kind of some of my hopes and concerns. How about you, Adam?
That's interesting. I remember it, and I remember thinking, well, maybe if the DDA was going to be part of one kind of holistic act which took all anti-discrimination laws and put them into one place. I maybe quite naively thought people might actually take a bit more notice of the law around disabled people. And I thought, and I've felt for some time now, that often disability is the correlation in equality. And I think there's research that's been done that around 90% of organisations say they prioritise diversity and inclusion, and 4% actually prioritise disability. So I guess for me, when the Equality Act was coming into play, I had hoped it might have mainstreamed, for better or worse, the law around disabled people and protecting disabled people from discrimination. I think in reality, as James already alluded to, I'm not convinced that has happened. I do remember at the time being hopeful that might be the case.
I think the other thing was, it was about the timing of it, because at that particular point in time, from memory, and it's hard to imagine now, but things were getting a lot better generally for disabled people. I think we were, having always been portrayed as objects of pity and, all of this kind of stuff. I think we were moving away from that, and people were beginning to see disability differently. But unfortunately, the launch of the Equalities Act coincided with the start of austerity.
Yeah.
And then everything, you know, rather than it being an impetus to continue the forward journey we were on, we seem to be going backwards quite quickly. So you can't blame the Act for that necessarily, but that's certainly something that affected the rights of disabled people dramatically in the last 10 years.
I'm sure, I guess, you know, if we're being blunt about it, the government almost gave one hand and took from another in terms of disabled rights and to be an equal and equitable member of society. I think that's a really good point, Jen.
And the narrative changed from objects of pity to benefit cheats.
Yeah.
And the whole reason that we're all suffering is because of all of those disabled people claiming benefits that we shouldn't be giving them because they wanted to justify cuts in benefit payments. And, you know, I think that really set us back in terms of rights, but also in terms of, you know, getting the opportunity to get jobs, because employers, quite understandably, don't want to employ lazy, work-shy benefit scroungers. They want to, you know, and I think the whole narrative changed and it became quite negative, not kind of pitying, but negative in a more brutal way. And I think we know that the incidence of hate crime, you know, shot up at that time, you know, towards lots of protected characteristics, but particularly towards disabled people, because there was a perception that it was our fault somehow, austerity was our fault. You know, the whole banking crisis that had happened if only we had that much power.
Yeah, I think good, wouldn't it? Yeah. And I won't say too much now, come up later, but I think it just shows that when we had the Equality Act put in place, the culture in this country didn't really reflect how positive the Equality Act could have been 10 years ago.
Yeah, wasted opportunity, definitely.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, thinking about it a bit more, one of the positives that kind of came out of the Equality Act was that it did start to get more and more people and organisations, again, not enough, but looking at the social model of disability. I don't know what you feel about that, Jane, whether you think the Equality Act has supported that journey.
Yeah, I think it does. I think the definition of disability under the Equalities Act isn't particularly social model friendly, but I think the ethos behind it in terms of removing barriers probably is. And I think that any change in the law like that gives us an opportunity to at least talk about, you know, issues that we might not have talked about previously, you know, that at least they're back on the agenda. And I think certainly disability activists have been talking about the social model, you know, since then much more openly. And I do think, you know, when I talk to both employers and actually other disabled people who've not come across the social model, that it has been life-changing. I mean, that sounds dramatic, but I think for a disabled person to suddenly realise, oh, there's nothing wrong with me, it's the barriers out there that are wrong, that's really empowering for a disabled person. But also it makes it much easier for employers to understand, actually, we can access that talent, all we need to do is remove the barriers. So we've got the conversation going, which has got to be a good thing, even if the law itself isn't always enacted and or policed.
I mean, next we were going to talk about kind of how it had met or failed to meet the expectations that have been set, and I think you've both done that brilliantly. And it's really interesting to think about two really kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of viewpoints on what a kind of general Equalities Act would mean for disabled people. One about meaning that we were going to get included in a conversation in a way that we hadn't been before, and one where we were going to be just as excluded as before, as it just became just another kind of check point or tick box that didn't need to be thought about. I wonder if you can reflect a little bit more on how you see that that's happened. Do you feel like disability is now more part of the kind of social dis and inclusion conversation than it was 10 years ago? Or do you think that it has just kind of continued to be disregarded in those conversations?
I think it's definitely more, when I look back to 10 years ago, which is just about when Evenbreak started, the conversation with employers was very much, as you said, Adam, that really disability was not just an afterthought. It wasn't a thought at all. If you talked about diversity, I mean, on the positive side, 10 years before that, if you'd have talked about diversity to an employer, they'd have looked at you like you'd come from Mars. What's that got to do with me? We're a business. At least 10 years ago, they were saying things like, well, we recognise we need to look at race and we recognise we need to look at gender. But if you then said, and do you recognise you need to look at disability, there'd be a kind of, we might be looking at that in a few years' time, or that's too difficult, or, oh, well, we put that under our wellbeing agenda, not our inclusion agenda, or whatever it might be. Definitely disability was way, way, way down the priorities. I do think it's gone up in the last, maybe say 3 or 4 years, much more than it had. It's less of a fight now to get it included. And that's very positive. I don't think that's any thanks to the Act particularly. I think that's down to organisations like D&I and us and other organisations really making it clear that, Valuable 500, for example, that you can't be a bit diverse-ish. If you're going to be, inclusive, you have to be inclusive. And that means everybody. That doesn't just mean those people over there and not those people over there, because that's not inclusion. And I think slowly, I wouldn't say we're at the top of the agenda, nothing like it, but I do think we're on the agenda now, which is a huge improvement from 10 years ago. It is becoming an easier conversation to have, I think.
I guess leading on from that, I would argue the reasons why we're on the agenda have changed. And I think when the DGA came in and then it morphed into the Equality Act, I think we might be on the agenda now and again if organisations and services were afraid of getting sued. I think there's a lot of fear on, if we don't have a ramp, we might get taken to court, so we better do something. Obviously, we know it's not wider than that. I think for a lot of businesses, it was quite a shallow way of kind of dealing with it. But actually, over the last 10 years, people are putting disability inclusion much higher, still not enough, but much higher on their agenda than what they were, just because, not because of the Equality Act, but because it's the right thing to do.
And also, of course, we had huge skill shortages, didn't we? I mean, prior to COVID, it's a bit different now, but prior to COVID, I think employers were realising, the pools of talent that we've been using all along aren't big enough, that we aren't finding the talent that we need. We've got massive skill shortages. We're going to have to look in different places. And, disabled people were, we were there waiting for them to find us. It wasn't that the talent wasn't there. It was that they weren't looking in the right places. So I think, that probably helped a little bit as well.
And you mentioned COVID, now sort of time to go into much detail, but I did think over the last 10 years, maybe especially quite sad in the last 6 months, that disability has been seen as a minority issue for quite a while. But now I think people realise that under the social model, anyone can face disablement or disabling barriers at certain times of their life. And I think sadly working from home in COVID has created more barriers for some people. So I just wonder in the last 10 years whether we've started to see a shift in organisations and people's minds. So that it's not just about a few people, disabled situations can actually impact anyone.
Yeah, and they have, haven't they, in the last few months, which has probably been a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of people. And unfortunately, there will be people, you know, who have long COVID, who will be, you know, disabled now in this from the social model aspect. And I do think also there's a kind of, oh, those people over there, those disabled people over there, but now it's come much closer to home, and it's actually, it could happen to me, could happen to somebody I love, it could happen to a friend. And so it's become much more real rather than a kind of academic theoretical issue. It's become a real personal issue for people. And I think as soon as people have any kind of lived experience of how that feels, it's much easier to have that conversation. You know, we heard people at the beginning of lockdown talking about, you know, I'm being forced to work from home, and you know, lots of people have to work from home because there's no other opportunity. You know, welcome to our world. But also, all of those years, all of those 10 years and longer, where people have been saying, can I work from home? The answer's been no, it can't be done. You know, we've had this conversation before. And then all of a sudden, yes, it can. It takes a pandemic to show people that it can be done. So I do wonder if, compared to where we were 10 years ago, we're in a better place in terms of people understanding that people can work from home, they can work in different ways. It doesn't have to be 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, driving in rush hour traffic. You know, that there are alternative ways of working, which are just as good, if not better. And, you know, bless COVID. I mean, I wish it never happened, but in some ways it's kind of accelerated that understanding of, you know, talent looks and feels different and can work in different ways, and, you know, all of that. So I do think we've progressed, even if it's by things we'd have hated to have happened. But I do think we're in a better place now in terms of people understanding the social model and understanding around disability than we were 10 years ago, when, as you say, most of it was around what do I have to do not to get sued, rather than, oh, we need more diverse talent, which is, I think, where people are coming from more so these days.
And hopefully, as you said, James, we never wanted COVID to happen, and it's been horrific for many people. But maybe when we're past it, we can have a new start, almost a new foundation when it comes to inclusion, where over the next 10 years we start to embrace a lot more different ways of working and make it more normalised.
And I think it's woken people up to, actually, this isn't just about disability, that, you know, lots of people have enjoyed working from home, not doing the 2-hour commute every day, spending more time with their family. And, you know, and so hopefully it won't just be, oh, here's a reasonable adjustment for a disabled person, but, you know, here's a choice for all of us. And if we're doing things for disabled people, which is what we were asking for before COVID, and we now recognise actually that way of working is good for lots and lots of people, it doesn't become a big thing about, oh, it's really a nuisance employing disabled people because we've got to think about all these things. It's about recognising that as a workforce, disabled or otherwise, we can work in different and better ways, and everybody's life improves. Because I don't know anybody who enjoys rush hour traffic, for example, but it may be that some people will go back to working at their workplace, but they will travel at different times, or maybe they'll only go in twice a week or 3 times a week, or whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be rigid. There are all sorts of different ways of working. I know that doesn't apply to a lot of frontline positions, of course, and it isn't an excuse not to make workplaces accessible. That's still as important as ever, so that disabled people have the choice also of whether to work at home or elsewhere. But I do think that, as you say, that I don't think we'll go back to the rigid, very monochromatic way of looking at the way we work, and people will recognise there's a whole range of ways we can work, and it's going to be much better for everybody. But then I am always an optimistic kind of person.
And so I think, yeah, it is a really valid point. I think the disability community as a whole is really aware of that it's a kind of welcome positive side effect of a really, really devastating crisis that we've all suffered from. And it has opened doors, not just in terms of the workplace, although those adaptations and flexibility have been really important, but also in terms of more societally. So being able to remotely connect with friends and families for social events, recognising that not everyone has the same immune system, community kind of support and mutual aid as well. I think those things have all kind of really become a bigger part of our lives. What do you think we can do in terms of steps and precautions to make sure that we don't do what a lot of people want to do and return to kind of normal once the pandemic is over?
I mean, that's a great question. This is such a huge opportunity, isn't it? I mean, it's awful that it's happened, but it does give us an opportunity to say, the world of work is going to be different now. And it would be easy, I think, to go back to how we were before. Some of my concerns are things like, the economy is clearly going to be taking a hit because of COVID, because of Brexit, for all sorts of different reasons. And all the money that's had to be spent during COVID, a return to austerity would be disastrous for disabled people. There are lots of disabled people who rely on care support who haven't been getting it during COVID, who may not get it in the future because budgets have been cut. And that prevents people from not just from working, but from leading an independent life, from making choices. I think we need to make absolutely sure that we don't ever go back to that kind of, oh, well, we can just cut support for disabled people because they're not really very important, and make sure that, we prioritise now. We've learnt that everybody's different, everybody needs different things, and we need to make sure we respond to those needs appropriately. So I think that's a huge thing for me, but also just about making sure that we don't forget, because we do, don't we? We forget very quickly when we move on to whatever the next shiny thing is, what we did learn through and suffer from through COVID, and make sure that, that the few silver linings that there were, that we don't let those go. Otherwise, it really is all just doom and gloom.
I think we, as a society, have the responsibility to make sure we don't go back. I think we've seen movements this year really start to stand up and say no to discrimination. I think maybe I'm being a bit too optimistic, but I hope that the communities and the society that we live in will drive a better place to be going forward, and I think it's all of our responsibilities to make sure we don't go back. And one thing that I am feeling positive about is having a really good conversation that I know DNA are having, and Jane said the same thing earlier, with organisations who want to get inclusion right, and there does seem to be a bit of a shift at the moment for wanting to get it right. So I think there is a danger of going back to a norm that, quite frankly, was disabling. But I just hope that the people won't let that happen.
I feel quite optimistic as well. I do think that there is, the conversations that we're having now do seem to be much more around equity and equality, talent, rather than legislation compliance. And I do think that, obviously we only work with those organisations who are already, converted. They're on board with this. They understand the necessity to have a diverse workforce and how they benefit from that. And not all organisations are there. But I do think that businesses and employers have an incredible role to play, in terms of changing culture. Yes, we can have legislation. Yes, we can argue about government policies, but actually people's work lives form a huge, we spend a lot of our waking lives at work. And if the workplace generally is becoming more diverse, so we see lots of different people there and more inclusive, that has a huge impact way outside of the workplace and society generally, because we're all people. We go to work or we stay at home and be at work, but then we talk to families and friends and, society generally. And I do think that business has a huge role to play, not just in terms of fair and equitable employment practices, but also in terms of, changing the narrative around diversity.
I think, if I can be slightly controversial for a minute, I think we've seen how much influence the economy has on government decision making, and for wrong reasons, but they do. So I think if we can get organisations and employers to get inclusion right, I think it'll put more pressure on the government to get it right.
Absolutely. And there's a whole thing about it isn't, I was talking to a really good recruiter in every other sense of the word good the other day, and he was saying, well, you know, the difficulty is it's getting that balance right between being inclusive and being commercial. No, the two things go together. The more inclusive you are, there's so much research out there that the more inclusive we are, the better our businesses are. And, you know, and I think we need, hopefully we'll change the narrative between, is it about health or the economy? They both have to work together, because neither of them are going to work without the other. We can't be healthy without money to spend on food and medicine, but we can't be economically active if we're ill. The two things have to be seen together. And maybe, you know, businesses, as you say, they can influence some of these policies and decisions, and rightly so in some ways. And hopefully we'll see that there is a correlation between the more diverse and inclusive we get, the better our businesses, the better our economy, the better our health. And actually it all melds together in one positive story. Whereas while we're separating everything out, we are getting one thing right and then something else plummets as a result of that. And that's no good for anybody.
So we've talked about inclusion and disability inclusion specifically. We've talked about adding us to the agenda, and you've both talked about the kind of the wonderful organisations that you do partner with or work with, who are really keen to be proactive in this. But we also all know there are lots of organisations and businesses who may say they're intending to be proactive, who may focus on ensuring that legally they're protected, but are either unwilling to or are intimidated by the concept of putting that thought into action. I know you both have really good practical advice and recommendations for what needs to be done to improve inclusivity and to ensure that it's felt as a responsibility by all of those organisations. So I wonder if you could both kind of share some practical steps that people can do to kind of improve the situation and improve disability inclusion.
I think there's things that organisations can do, but even before that, I think there are things that the government can and should do. One of the big steps forward, I think, that we made in inclusion recently, in recent years, was the mandatory reporting on the gender pay gap. Because every employer I talked to that year were absolutely looking, you know, focusing on the gender pay gap, either reluctantly or willingly, but nevertheless, that was their focus. And I think, although I would much rather that organisations do things on a voluntary basis, and most of the organisations we work with are doing that, but as you say, Ellie, there are loads of organisations that do the bare minimum or less. I think if there was a mandatory requirement to report on not necessarily the disability pay gap, although that's important because that's about 20% at the moment, the TUC have recently worked out, but the disability employment gap, which we know is around 30%. And if organisations had to report on disability pay, how many disabled people they employ, where they are in the organisation, so it's no good saying, well, we've got loads, but they're all in low paid, low status, and insecure work. I do think it would just focus the mind. And I think the same with race. I think that, you know, they're talking about having a race pay gap, mandatory reporting as well. And I do think, although I hate the fact that we have to force people to do things that they should be doing anyway, it really does focus the mind. And I think until we get that kind of mandatory requirement for organisations, I get very annoyed about, for example, if you're a disabled job seeker and you're not seen to be doing enough to find work, then you can be sanctioned. So there's a black and white. If you don't do this, we're not going to give you money to live on. Whereas with employers, it's kind of, you know, we'd quite like you to sign up to Disability Confident. It'd be really nice if you did. You don't necessarily have to go any further, but it would be really good if you did. But it doesn't really matter if you don't. There's a real dichotomy there because the disabled job seeker can't force employers to be more inclusive, but employers can make themselves more inclusive. And then the disabled job seeker doesn't have the problem finding the job in the first place. So I think if we're going to say things are mandatory for disabled job seekers to do, then we need to have at least a minimum mandatory, standard that all employers should. And I know we don't want more red tape for employers, and I'm an employer and I have a small business, and we don't want lots and lots of red tape, but I think basic, just basic actions to make sure that you are a fair and decent employer is not too much to ask of anybody. And if they're not willing to do it voluntarily, well, let's make it mandatory. That's a bit, I know, provoking, but hey.
It is provoking, Jim, but we need that. We need to provoke change in how things work. And it's really interesting, I think, you highlighted, pointed out the disabled job seekers have to be seen doing X, Y, and Z, otherwise they don't get support. Yeah, there's no stick, I guess, for the employer to do better. I think that's really a really interesting point. I guess I just wanted to build on that, and there's a couple of sayings that we use quite a lot within DNA. And the first one is the Qualities Act, and complying with the Qualities Act means that you don't get sued. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you include. And the second quote, I guess, that we use quite a lot is culture kills compliance. And actually, whilst the Qualities Act is a key pillar in our society, actually, we need to go beyond that. We need to get culture right. And when you get the culture right, everything else, I believe, follows. And as you were saying a minute ago, it's about taking an intersectional approach. And I think, quite a direct message to organisations, I think, is that the gender pay gap came to light, sadly, because quite frankly, the BBC got caught with their pants down. So I guess organisations need to think about that. And what I would hate to see is that in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, we're sat here talking about a disability pay gap because culture hadn't changed by then. So now is the time to get inclusion right.
Absolutely. And I do think that, my hope is that those organisations who are doing this, not for legislation compliance, but because they can see that it's good for their business, it's good for everybody. If they can influence other businesses, and we're talking, major companies here who are taking this on board, then I think their influence with other companies, we encourage large employers to look at their supply chain, for example. So it's, so it kind of the good practice filters out. I know some organizations are really good at this, HS2, for example. So they expect their supply chain to take disability equality and equality generally as seriously as they do. And getting contracts, huge government contracts, is dependent on it. The government itself could be much more instrumental in this. They spend an absolute fortune, as we know, test and trace and private companies and all the rest of it. And whether you agree with that or not, they have the power to say to those organisations, you won't get these contracts unless you demonstrate that you're not just meeting the Equalities Act, but that you actually are doing all of the things that we think you should be doing. And people will do it. They might do it for the wrong reason at first because they want the contract. But eventually they'll say, well, actually, we're doing this and it's really working for us. So we don't need a financial incentive because we recognise that in and of itself, we get our own rewards, but we're not there yet. And I think if some of the larger companies were told, you won't get these government contracts or big contracts with big employers unless you can demonstrate, not just show us that you've got a written policy in a dusty drawer somewhere, but demonstrate, how many diverse people work for you, where they're at in the organization, look at your C-suite, look at your board of directors, and all of that sort of stuff, then people will really have to focus on this from a commercial perspective.
Absolutely. And it's really useful to think about that, because those are hopes, but they're realistic, they're achievable hopes. And you both kind of talked a little bit about now what we're thinking about the future and where we want to be. And Adam, you specifically mentioned kind of thinking about 5-10 years in the future. So imagine we're having the same conversation in 2030. What kind of conversation would you want that to be? What shifts would you want to be celebrating?
I'd love for there to be no diversity and ability, and for there to be no Evenbreak, because we're no longer needed. That would be my absolute fantasy vision, that actually society has absorbed the fact that we're all different, and that's great. And let's work with that and embrace it. I think that's a fairly unlikely fantasy to happen, actually, to be honest. But I certainly hope that we are much more in the game of helping people become more inclusive and accessible, rather than having to persuade them that they need to be, and that people are willing to learn and learn from each other, and that all of that is led by lived experience, so that employers have diverse people within their teams that they are learning from, so that they can improve what they do, without necessarily needing specialist intervention from outside. I'd be very happy to do myself out of a job if that was a society that we were living in, apart from which I'll be 70, so I should be heading for retirement at that point anyway.
I won't be retiring in 10 years, quite unfortunately. Again, I'd love to join you.
That's because you're young, that's why.
I think James hit the nail on the head. In 10 years, it'd be great if we didn't have to exist, because it was inclusive and accessible. That is my hope. But I also agree with Jane that I think that's unfortunately, I think it's a very unrealistic hope. I guess what I would like to be seeing in the next 10 years is, whilst you cannot ever compare barriers with other barriers, I would like to think that some of the fundamental rights of disabled people, like independent living, that kind of thing, and access to mental health services, that kind of thing, I would hope that we'll be in a much more better place in society, and that we can focus more on the more kind of specific barriers, and look at changing the mindset to it being about celebrating diversity more. We're starting to do that, but I'm not quite sure everyone's ready for that, because I think they're still stuck in quite a medical model, unfortunately. So I'd agree with Jane, but I guess realistically, I hope that the fundamentals that unfortunately are still not met in this country might be a little bit more founded in our day-to-day. Well, if that makes sense.
And wouldn't it be good if we could make, we have made some strides forward, even in this year, but wouldn't it be lovely if we could do that without there having to be a tragedy first? So Black Lives Matter has actually sparked an awful lot of good stuff happening. But why did George Floyd have to die for that to happen? It should be happening anyway. And I think the newfound understanding of inclusion and flexible working and working in different ways, but that was sparked by a global pandemic that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could make some really big leaps forward in terms of inclusion without a tragedy having to happen first? Yeah. That would be great.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that involves people being willing to get uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is, I think for so long now, and again, even under the Equalities Act, the Equalities Act is a pillar of inclusion in our society. But let's be really honest about it. The Equalities Act is broken probably every second of every minute and every hour of every day, sadly. And I think
no consequences.
and I think we really need to not keep being blinkered in society and pretend that it's not happening when actually we're pretending it's not happening, because when we think about it, it makes us a bit uncomfortable. So I think we need to be prepared to get uncomfortable and say that we got things really, really horribly wrong, and actually come together and make a better world over 10 years.
And that short-term discomfort is worth it because the rewards after it will be so immense. Yeah. So it's not just being uncomfortable for the sake of it, is it? It's actually going through a process that actually means we all gain at the end of it.
But yeah, I think it's better to say that we saw a lot of people feel really uncomfortable after George Biden with that Lives Matter, and a lot of people just didn't really understand the kind of response that came out after that. I think it's because they just didn't want to feel uncomfortable and be open about how society has treated people right under our noses. So I think we need to get past that, stand together and really get authentic inclusion right.
Yeah, I'm still confident that that might happen, because I think the difference this time with Black Lives Matter, from what I saw, was that the people who were supporting Black Lives Matter were much more diverse than in previous times. So I hope, and again, I am an optimist by nature, but I hope now it isn't just Black people that are promoting Black people's rights and disabled people who are promoting disabled people's rights and women who are promoting women's rights, but actually there's a bigger recognition that we're all in this. And actually, if we don't live in an inclusive society, we're all intersectional. We're all going to lose out. And actually recognizing that racism is bad for everybody, treating disabled people, with discrimination is everybody suffers from that, and I think it's actually trying to help people see that inclusion benefits everybody, not just any particular protected characteristic or group of people that are identified in a law, but actually an inclusive society, we all win, nobody loses. Straight, white, non-disabled men, who tend to feel like the victims amongst this, are just as important as everybody else, and can be, huge allies in this movement. And I think it's about acknowledging that we all have a part to play, and it's all valuable, and every voice should be listened to equally. We're a way off that yet, but I do think we're making some progress, I think.
One thing I would like to see in the next 10 years that I think is achievable, and I think we as organisations can make it happen, is I would like to see society talking about disablement instead of disabled people. And actually, disabled people don't need to be a term. Like, if we can really, truly embrace the social model of disability, then we need to look at disabling circumstances, barriers, disablement, instead of still putting it on the individual, which I think is so easily done within society in terms of the language that still exists. So that's a a little personal hope that will come true in the next 10 years. I hope.
We are optimistic, aren't we?
Indeed.
Thank you both for really, really powerful points there. And hopefully they should be achievable goals. They absolutely should be. And it's exciting to envision that future. And hopefully we will get there, and we'll get there without kind of suffering the tragedies and losses that we have all suffered, whether it's as individuals, as communities, or kind of in society as a whole as well. Thank you both so much. I think it's been such a valuable conversation. We've shared some frustrations, which are really important to talk about, and also some viable hopes for the future and what we can do to get there, again, as individuals, as a society, in terms of governmental shift that, although we aren't individually responsible for, we can hopefully lobby for and campaign for and encourage others to do the same. I was going to say, see you both in 10 years for another one of these, but hopefully none of us will exist in terms of our organisations by that point, and we'll never have to have this conversation again because it just won't be needed, as you both say. So thank you so much.